My sister told everyone at Christmas dinner, "You're adopted anyway. Stop pretending you're family." I just smiled and revealed the DNA test I'd taken of both of us. Now the whole family's calling me nonstop. I, 32M, had always been the odd one out in my family. Where everyone else had dark hair and olive skin, I was blonde and fair. Where they were naturally athletic and outgoing, I was the bookish one who preferred libraries to football fields. My sister, 3 years younger, never let me forget it. Christmas dinner 2024 started like any other family gathering. Mom had prepared her usual feast. Dad was already halfway through his second beer, and the extended family filled every chair around the dining table. Uncle Tom was telling his annual hunting story, while Aunt Sarah fussed over the gravy. Everything felt normal until my sister decided to drop her bomb. The conversation had somehow shifted to family traditions and heritage. Dad was explaining how our great-grandfather had built the family farm with his bare hands, how that fighting spirit ran in our blood. I made some comment about carrying on that legacy when my sister's face darkened. She told me to stop pretending I belonged here, that everyone knew I was different. The table went quiet. Then she delivered the killing blow, that I was adopted anyway and should stop acting like I was actually family. The silence that followed was deafening. Forks stopped midair. Uncle Tom's hunting story died on his lips. Even the kids at the smaller table seemed to sense something had shifted. All eyes turned to me, waiting for my reaction. I smiled. 3 months earlier, I'd submitted DNA samples to one of those ancestry websites. Not mine, ours. Both mine and my sister's. What I discovered had been sitting in my email for weeks, waiting for the right moment. This was it. I pulled out my phone with steady hands and opened the email. I told the table I had something interesting to share about family heritage. My sister's smugness faltered slightly, but she maintained her defensive posture. I read the results aloud. According to the DNA analysis, my sister and I shared exactly 0 genetic markers. None. We weren't siblings. We weren't even distantly related. In fact, the test suggested she wasn't biologically related to anyone at this table. The color drained from my sister's face. Mom dropped her wine glass. Dad's chair creaked as he leaned forward, asking me to repeat what I'd just said. I explained calmly that I'd been curious about our family tree and decided to test both our DNA. The results were conclusive. She was the adopted one, not me. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. My sister started backtracking immediately, claiming DNA tests weren't reliable, that I was lying, that this was some sick joke. But Mom had gone completely white and excused herself to the kitchen. Dad followed her. The rest of the family sat in stunned silence. My cousins exchanged glances. Grandma, bless her heart, asked if someone could explain what DNA meant. Through the kitchen doorway, I could hear hushed, urgent voices. Mom was crying. Dad's voice was strained, defensive. The conversation was clearly intense, but I couldn't make out specific words over the awkward small talk that had resumed at the table. When my parents returned 20 minutes later, Mom's eyes were red and swollen. Dad looked like he'd aged 10 years. They sat down heavily, and Mom cleared her throat. She confirmed what the DNA test had revealed. My sister had been adopted when she was 6 months old. They'd planned to tell both of us when we were older, but somehow the years kept passing and the moment never felt right. They'd convinced themselves it didn't matter because we'd grown up as siblings. The revelation that followed was even more shocking. Mom explained that they'd struggled with fertility issues after having me. When they found out about my sister through a private adoption agency, they thought they were giving me a sibling and completing our family. They never intended to keep it a secret forever. My sister was completely broken. All these years, she'd tormented me about being different, about not belonging, and it turned out she was projecting her own unconscious insecurities. The very thing she'd accused me of was her reality. She tried to apologize, saying she never knew, that she'd always felt different too, but never understood why. The words came out between sobs, but I wasn't feeling particularly charitable in that moment. I told her that feeling different didn't excuse 26 years of making me feel unwelcome in my own family, that her cruelty had shaped how I saw myself, how I interacted with relatives, how I felt during every family gathering. The damage was already done. Christmas dinner ended early that year. The extended family filtered out awkwardly, unsure how to process what they'd witnessed. Some offered quiet words of support to my parents. Others just left quickly, avoiding eye contact. Update 1. The aftermath began immediately. My phone started ringing before I even got home that evening. First, it was my sister, crying and begging me to talk to her. Then Mom, asking me to please call back so we could discuss this as a family. Dad sent text messages asking me to be understanding about how difficult this was for everyone. I ignored them all that first night. I needed time to process what had happened, and honestly, I felt vindicated. For decades, my sister had used my perceived outsider status as ammunition against me. Every argument, every family disagreement, every moment of sibling rivalry had been punctuated by her reminders that I didn't really belong. Now the tables had turned completely. The calls kept coming over the next few days. Aunt Sarah wanted to know if I was okay. Uncle Tom, surprisingly, called to say he'd always thought my sister was too harsh on me, and that maybe this would teach her some humility. Even my cousins reached out, mostly with messages of support, but also curiosity about how I'd known to test both our DNA. That part was simple. I'd been researching our family genealogy as a surprise Christmas gift for Dad. I wanted to trace back his stories about our great-grandfather and create a family tree. When I decided to include DNA testing for accuracy, I thought it would be fun to see how closely my sister and I matched up genetically, maybe find some interesting health markers we shared. I never expected to discover she wasn't my biological sister at all. My sister's calls became increasingly desperate. She left voicemails explaining that she'd always felt like something was missing, that she'd lashed out at me because she felt insecure about her place in the family. She said she understood now why she'd always felt different, why she never quite felt like she fit in despite being the more social, outgoing one. Her apologies felt genuine, but I wasn't ready to forgive yet. 26 years of being told I didn't belong, of having my appearance mocked, of being excluded from real family conversations, that damage doesn't heal overnight just because the truth comes out. Mom's calls were the hardest to ignore. She kept explaining that they'd made a mistake in not telling us sooner, that they'd been trying to protect both of us. She said they'd convinced themselves that love was what made a family, not biology, and they hadn't wanted either of us to feel less valued. I understood their reasoning intellectually, but emotionally I was still processing everything. Part of me felt betrayed that they'd let me endure years of questioning my place in the family when they could have simply told us the truth. Update 2. 2 weeks after Christmas, I finally agreed to meet with my parents. We chose a neutral location, a quiet coffee shop downtown, where we could talk without the emotional weight of being in the family home. Mom looked exhausted. Dad seemed nervous, constantly fidgeting with his coffee cup. They both started talking at once, then stopped, then gestured for the other to continue. The awkwardness was painful. Dad finally took the lead. He explained the full story of my sister's adoption. They'd been trying for a second child for 3 years when a friend connected them with a young woman who was pregnant and looking for a family for her baby. The adoption was arranged privately, quickly, and they brought my sister home when I was 3 years old. Their intention had been to explain the situation to both of us when we were old enough to understand. But as we grew up, we seemed like natural siblings despite our personality differences. They convinced themselves that the biological connection didn't matter since we'd bonded as brother and sister. What they hadn't anticipated was how my sister's insecurity would manifest as attacks on my belonging in the family. Mom said they'd noticed it over the years, but attributed it to normal sibling rivalry. They thought she was just being mean, not acting out from her own unconscious feelings of displacement. I asked them directly why they never corrected her when she claimed I was adopted. Dad's answer was telling. He said they thought if they made a big deal about defending my biological connection, it might make my sister feel less secure about her place in the family. So they'd sacrificed my emotional security to protect hers, without either of us knowing the real situation. I told them I understood their dilemma, but that their solution had caused me real psychological damage. I'd spent my entire life feeling like an outsider in my own family, wondering if there was something fundamentally wrong with me that made me so different from everyone else. Mom started crying again. She kept repeating that they'd made a terrible mistake, that they'd tried to do right by both of us, but had failed us both instead. The conversation lasted 3 hours. By the end, I felt like I understood their perspective, even if I didn't agree with their choices. They were young parents who'd made a decision they thought was best at the time, then found themselves trapped by that decision as the years passed. I agreed to family therapy. All 4 of us needed professional help to navigate this situation. My sister had been calling daily, but I still wasn't ready to talk to her directly. I asked my parents to tell her I needed more time, but that I wasn't cutting her out permanently. I just needed space to process everything before we could have a productive conversation. Update 3. Family therapy started in February. Our therapist was a middle-aged woman who specialized in adoption and family dynamics. She had a calm, direct manner that cut through our emotional chaos and helped us focus on the actual issues. The sessions were intense. My sister finally got to express how she'd always felt like she was performing belonging, trying to be more family-oriented than anyone else to prove her place. She said attacking my connection to the family was her way of deflecting attention from her own insecurities. I got to explain how her constant undermining had affected my self-image, my relationships with extended family, and my overall sense of identity. For the first time, she really listened instead of getting defensive. My parents had to confront how their well-intentioned deception had damaged both their children. The therapist helped them understand that keeping family secrets to protect people often causes more harm than the truth would have. What surprised me most was learning that my sister had always planned to search for her biological family once she turned 30. She'd been working up the courage to ask our parents for help with that search. Finding out through my DNA revelation had robbed her of the agency to discover her origins on her own terms. That aspect hadn't occurred to me. I'd been so focused on the vindication of proving I belonged that I hadn't considered how devastating it must have been for her to learn about her adoption in front of the entire extended family. The therapy sessions helped us both recognize how we'd been fighting over something neither of us had controlled, the circumstances of our family formation. We'd both been children when these decisions were made, and we'd both suffered from the adults' choices about how to handle them. Slowly, carefully, my sister and I began rebuilding our relationship. It wasn't the same as before. Too much had been said and done for that. But it was honest in a way it had never been previously. She stopped attacking my place in the family because she finally understood that belonging isn't determined by biology. I stopped feeling defensive about my differences because I knew they didn't threaten my connection to my parents. The extended family took longer to adjust. Some relatives handled it well, treating my sister exactly the same as before. Others seemed awkward around her, as if they didn't know how to act now that they knew she wasn't really family. That bothered me more than I expected. Watching my sister navigate those changed dynamics made me realize that my Christmas revelation had consequences beyond just our immediate family. I'd exposed her secret to people who hadn't signed up for that information and didn't necessarily know how to process it appropriately. 6 months later, we're still in therapy, but the sessions are monthly now instead of weekly. My sister and I have developed a new dynamic based on honesty rather than hidden resentments. She's also started searching for her biological family, with my parents' full support. The phone calls finally stopped after I started answering them. Most relatives just wanted reassurance that our family was okay and that they hadn't somehow contributed to the dysfunction by not noticing the adoption secret. Uncle Tom, surprisingly, became my sister's biggest defender among the extended family. When someone made a thoughtless comment about her not being real family, he shut it down immediately by pointing out that she'd been his niece for 29 years and a DNA test wasn't going to change that. Looking back, I don't regret revealing the truth that Christmas evening. My sister's cruelty had reached a breaking point, and the family secret was causing ongoing damage to both of us. But I do wish I'd handled the revelation more privately, given her the dignity of learning about her adoption without an audience. The situation taught me that revenge, even justified revenge, often comes with costs you don't anticipate. I got the vindication I wanted, but I also hurt someone who was already struggling with identity issues she didn't fully understand. We're rebuilding our relationship on more honest ground now. She's still my sister, the only one I've ever known, regardless of what any DNA test says. But we both learned that family dynamics are complicated and that sometimes the people who hurt us most are fighting their own battles we know nothing about. The call stopped months ago, but the conversations about family, belonging, and truth are ongoing. Some Christmas dinners change everything, and you can never go back to the way things were before. Sometimes that's exactly what needs to happen.